Good afternoon and welcome to the 141st of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID 19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today we will discuss COVID 19 in the Anthropocene with Christoph Russell and Bernd Scherer. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics. And please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. And I just want to amplify this because people have been reaching out of late, suggesting ideas, friends, colleagues, and themselves. And I really do appreciate that. This coming Friday, we're going to have a memorial episode in which we're going to read obituaries. This is in part of the marked by COVID week of mourning that's going on right now, and still looking for a couple of people who might like to come on to the program and read an obituary and explain what it means to them. So please get in touch with me by email sgk23@drexel.edu, or you can find me on Twitter @US of Disaster, and you can direct message me there and let me know if you're interested in participating, even for just 10 minutes. As of today, October 5th, 2020, there are 1,038,797 deaths from COVID 19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 7,433,828 cases in the United States. That's up from 7,292,422 cases reported on Friday. There are now a total of 209,881 deaths from COVID 19 reported in the United States. That's up from 208,068 reported on Friday. Again, keeping very close to that 1,000 deaths a day rate that we've been at for so long. In Germany, there have been a total of 9,533 deaths reported from COVID 19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I'd like to continue that now. We've heard a lot about Walter Reed Hospital and Veterans Affairs in the last couple of days. It seemed appropriate to read this one. Headline: COVID-infected VA therapist suspected he was dying, friend says. This is by Michael Ruane and was published on April 30th in the Washington Post. At 11:21 a.m. on April 14th, Caroline Songos got a Facebook message from her old friend Calvin Richardson Jr., with whom she had worked for 6 years at Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington. He was in the hospital, he said, and he regretted to tell her that he had the coronavirus and was not doing well. In hindsight, she said this week she believes he knew he was dying and wanted to include her in the circle of friends whom he informed. He wanted the people he was close to know, she said. I was grateful. That, for me, was a gift. 5 days later, she got a phone call that he had died in the University of Maryland Charles Regional Medical Center in La Plata, Maryland. Mr. Richardson, as she said she always called him, worked with her in the substance abuse rehabilitation program at the VA hospital. He was 57, she said. She had left the hospital in June after 14 years there as a psychotherapist. She said Richardson was an addiction therapist who ran substance abuse recovery groups and did case management, among other things. We shared patients, Songos said. We were very family-oriented as a treatment team. He was always extremely warm and gentle, she said. The veterans loved him. He was an Army veteran, she said. He was the kind of person who, if you stopped by to talk to him, he would always make time, even if he had other things he needed to do, she said. He had children. He had grandchildren. He was very involved in his children's lives. His son, Amari, in a Facebook post the day he died, called his father, my hero and my backbone. I don't understand what lesson I'm supposed to learn from this or why this is happening, he wrote April 19th. They had just spoken the day before. I told you how much I love you. Just stay strong. And you told me, I know, son, I love you too. Don't worry. I'm so heartbroken right now and empty. I really lost my best friend, he wrote. I love you, Pops, always and forever. Songos said Richardson and his wife had just moved into a new home in the Maryland suburbs. In the message exchange, Richardson told me that he had contracted COVID-19 and that he had pneumonia, she said. He said one day he got it and the next day he was in the hospital and that he was really struggling. He was a light in the clinic, she said. He always was smiling. He had a great sense of humor. He was genuinely interested in other people's well-being and was a very compassionate person. Honest to God, he was a salt of the earth good guy, she said. I'm beside myself that he died so quickly at such a young age. A truly good soul. Okay, I'm going to bring up my guests now and introduce them. It's good to see friends and very excited to introduce my guests today as we talk about the Anthropocene. Christoph Rosol is group leader of the umbrella project Knowledge in and of the Anthropocene and a researcher and curator at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Berlin, the House of World Culture, or for short, HKW. He studied the history of science and media studies in Berlin and Toronto. In 2012, he became a pre-doctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and later that year, a research associate in HKW's The Anthropocene Project. As a member of the curatorial team ever since, he's been principally involved in devising and developing the follow-up projects Technosphere and the long-term initiative Anthropocene Curriculum, a global platform for experimental research and education that he co-heads with Katrin Klingen. In his doctoral research, he deals with the prehistory and history of epistemic foundations of general circulation models, which are derived from numerical weather prediction techniques, but have now evolved into a core component of so-called Earth system models. The second guest, Dr. Bernd Scherer, has been a director of the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Berlin, since 2006, and he's held an honorary professorship at the Institute for European Ethnology at the Humboldt University of Berlin since 2011. His central areas of work lie in philosophy, semiotics, aesthetics, and intercultural questions. Since 2012, Scherer has headed the Anthropocene Project, and since 2014, the project 100 Years of Now, both at HKW. He is curating the Dictionary of Now as part of the latter project. Parallel to this, he's overseeing the conceptual development of HKW's third large-scale project, the New Alphabet. In his tenure at HKW, Scherer has guided its conceptual development from an institution that presented non-European cultures into one dedicated to the curating of ideas in the making, in a world that is changing not only globally, but also in planetary terms. Bernd and Christoph, welcome to COVID Calls.
Thanks
Hello.
for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I'd like to start the way that I usually do. Let me just remind folks, too, at the outset that you can get your questions in. If you're watching on YouTube Live, just put them into the YouTube Live chat. If you're watching on Periscope, following on Twitter, just post your questions there and we'll get them that way. Or you can email me directly at sgk23@drexel.edu. So I'll start the way I usually do, which is to just ask you each where you're calling from and what the COVID-19 pandemic situation is looking like there today. Christoph, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm calling from Berlin, Schöneberg, which is one of the inner districts in Berlin. The situation in Berlin currently is actually more on the downside of things. I would say we haven't been hit very hard by the pandemic so far. We were coming through the first wave in March and April pretty well, even though we had of course a big lockdown in place, and then the summer was simmering on, and now, as many have expected, we see numbers rising pretty fast, so that half of the inner districts of Berlin are now considered to be risk areas. If people would want to travel within Germany, several states, provinces would enforce a quarantine for people like me, for instance.
What's been the situation as far as your work at the Max Planck Institute? Has it been open? Have you been able to go in, or are you doing everything remotely?
Well, we had a shutdown, an almost complete shutdown, with just a basic crisis team being present at the institute for I think about 2 months, maybe 10 weeks, and then a gradual reopening of the institute. With the usual requirements. You have to be put on a list in order to enter the building. Only one person per room, etc. Until it got kind of normal again in late August, early September, and just as of today, we received a new requirement to wear masks inside the building at basically all times.
Thanks for giving us that context, Bernd. Let me ask you the same question: where you're calling from, and how's it looking there?
Yeah, I live in the same city than Christoph does. So Christoph gave you already quite a number of information about the situation here in Berlin. Just one observation during the lockdown that brought really urban life to a standstill to some extent. But nowadays, if you go through the streets, you have at least publicly in the open, many people on the streets, almost a normal life on the streets, at least. That changed quite dramatically from, let's say, April up to now. As far as my institution is concerned, the HKW, Cultural Institution in the center of Berlin, we had a lockdown from mid of March up to beginning of May, where people basically worked at home office, but we were more or less all connected with each other, had workshop teams going on during that time, but didn't have any programming going on. So the place was closed for the public. We kept the place closed for the public up to end of May, and communicated that right from the beginning, that we are not going to do any programming for, let's say, 2 months at least. Then what changed is end of April, it became clearer and clearer that there is a difference between the corona transmission indoor and outdoor. That the outdoor situation is much more with much less problems connected. So we started to think to develop an outdoor program. We have a wonderful roof terrace at the house, and summer is approaching in end of April, beginning of May. So we developed an outdoor program basically addressing the Berliners, the Berlin cultural scene, as well as audiences from Berlin. So we developed a program where basically Berlin artists, musicians, writers were involved in this program. And it was really addressed to the people in Berlin, because you really started to feel after 2-3 months that people wanted to get out of their homes, wanted to get into the open, wanted to have social communication with others. So the question was only how to develop procedures and protocols to deal with the situation. And as I mentioned, that was much easier to do in the outdoor facilities than it was to do indoor. So that was one reaction, that we developed this kind of outdoor program. The other was, I think, like a lot of cultural institutions did in the last months, think of new ways to deal with the digital and not digital programming. At the beginning, as you probably discussed already, a lot of people or a lot of institutions just put analog programs in the digital world. We didn't do that because we thought digital presentation needs other formats, other forms of and other aesthetics to be developed. So we developed a program which we call CC World, CC dot world, where we invited around 25 artists around the world to reflect the situation we are in. And that became quite interesting for us in as far as the conceptual methods of the artists were concerned, but also the content of the program. So we developed basically this kind of two-line reaction, outdoor programs for the Berlin audiences and digital programming for international and global audiences. Sorry, I don't understand you.
No, I was just,
Okay.
we had just a slight delay on the internet, but I think we're fine now. I was just going to bring that CC World up on so people can check that out, ccworld.hkw.de, to see that. I think it's really resonates, with folks I've talked to who are in the museum world in the United States. The Penn Museum here, I did several sessions with the Academy of Natural Sciences, which I think both of you are familiar with here in Philadelphia. It's the oldest natural science museum in America. And what they found was that there was this immediate demand placed on them, that there were a lot of schools and organizations that, as part of their regular yearly program, really expected those institutions to provide content and interactivity with them. And so it placed enormous demand on their education teams to take programs that may not even be completely finished and bring them up into some sort of online interactive. And it seems like that's something similar with you, right, Bernd?
Yeah, I mean, there was a third line of work which we did online, which relates directly to the Anthropocene project too. I mean, the house in the last 10 years was working basically on major transformation processes of our societies. And as has been quite often said already or mentioned in the context of the COVID crisis, is that the COVID crisis to some extent accelerated or focused on already existing transformation processes and brought them into the light to some extent. So what we did is related to actual developments. We used also our archive to bring out of the archive, so to say, programmings which we did in the last 5-6 years, and related, so to say, this kind of knowledge space the house developed in the last years to the actual developments. And I think when we come to discuss the relationship between COVID and the Anthropocene, we can go into more details to discuss that.
That's
I think this is a very interesting work. I really work with how to animate the archive in this kind of crisis.
That's such an interesting question, and also speaks to the uniqueness of the Anthropocene project and the Anthropocene curriculum that you've both been pursuing with your colleagues there, which is, it's not normal, at least the way I think of cultural institutions in general, to follow a program of development over so many years in a particular area so that you actually have an archive to draw from. And let me reframe around the Anthropocene a little bit, now, and this is what I wanted to speak with you both about. I had Dipesh Chakrabarty on earlier. He was with me in May, and we talked about the Anthropocene. And it has come up multiple times in my conversations in COVID calls, talking about environmental justice and topics like that. I'd like to go back into it, maybe from the ground up, so to speak. Christoph, let me ask you, if you don't mind, just to do some definitional work for us. What's the Anthropocene?
Well, if that term has slipped the attention of your guests yet, in a nutshell, as everyone knows, geological time is divided up into different slices and different periods and epochs. And as it turns out, humans or the industrialized humankind has apparently brought on an entirely new geological epoch, one that is succeeding the Holocene. The Holocene is this basically the geological epoch after the end of the last ice age, the Wisconsin Ice Age in North America, that ended 11,700 years ago. And then we inherited this extremely stable climate of the Holocene epoch, in which basically all human civilization or higher civilization thrived, was born and thrived. And now, within the last few centuries, if not even decades, we have turned the world upside down again, and push the natural state of the global environment into a new Earth system state that geologists have tentatively called the Anthropocene. Anthropos meaning humans, and scene is the new, meaning the new state or the new period. And basically, in common usage, the Anthropocene denotes pretty much everything that we currently discuss under the headings of the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, ocean acidification, basically all the biogeochemical transitions that our industrial activities have produced so far. And even beyond that, this term has made a gigantic impact, not just on the natural sciences, but also on the cultural sciences and in the sort of general debate about what does it mean, what agency do humans, and which humans, which part of the humanity has which agency that has actually, turned not our species maybe, but as a specific form of industrial capitalist production and society into such a dominant earth-shaping figure.
It's such an interesting point to make too, that historians and humanists, social scientists like ourselves haven't really waited around for the geologists to settle their normal geological disputes before we kind of jumped in and started using the concept as a way to understand environmental change over time and inequality and many other kinds of issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about. What is the state of play right now? Bernd, let me ask you, as far as the Anthropocene Working Group and the geological component of it, has the term been now formally accepted by the geological community?
Not yet. The process of formalizing the Anthropocene concept is still going on. At the moment, I don't know if Christoph mentioned that there are procedures how to define or how to formalize such an Earth epoch. And part of this process is that there is an Anthropocene working group which has been established more than 10 years ago, consisting out of more than 30 scientists around the world, basically earth scientists, geologists, but also from some other disciplines like international law. People are involved in this process. Archaeologists are involved in the process. So their task is to collect the evidences worldwide in order to prepare the formalization. And one major part of this process is to define the golden spike. The golden spike is, so to say, the symbol, the iconic place where the material processes manifest themselves as a new epoch. And in order to do so, they had to develop a scheme, a global scheme of points where they take scores out of the sediments in order to look to which extent humans have really transformed the Earth system. So this kind of investigation, this kind of research of producing these scores and then of analyzing them according to different kind of parameters, markers, is in the process now, and probably will be finished by 2022. And at the moment, the idea is that end of 2022, the Anthropocene Working Group is proposing one golden spike to another commission, who then takes the final decisions on that. So it's a long time process. I mean, the hypothesis of as it is discussed now was done in 2000. The working group was established around 2008, and probably by 2024, 25, we will have final results, if at all.
Just to remind folks, you're listening to COVID Calls, and talking about the Anthropocene and the pandemic today with Bernd Scherer and Christoph Rosol. So thank you both for situating us in the Anthropocene. And it's important, I think, to lay down that definition and that trajectory a little bit, because it kind of sets up for us a discussion about how we might find some commonalities in the COVID world, you know, the many different ways that COVID is manifesting itself, which may somehow seem, of course, they're geographically disparate, and of course, they're affecting people differently. But the thinking with an anthropocenic mind on this, you know, bringing them into an anthropocenic frame helps, I think, from an explanatory point of view. I wonder, Christoph, let me just ask you first, well, some of the different things that we're seeing in this sort of COVID-19 reality. Could you talk a little bit about how you see those in connection with the Anthropocene idea? In other words, how does the Anthropocene make a world in which COVID-19 flourishes?
Well, I see that happening on probably several registers at once. For one, if you take the view of the Anthropocene, if you really zoom out from the current moment, you recognize COVID-19 as a dot in a pattern. Maybe, you know, it's a sign that the Earth is transitioning. That risks for life on Earth is increasing, including human life and human health. Because there is a lot of mobility between species. Everyone knows that COVID-19 has emerged from probably a bat that's transmitted the virus via a pangolin, then to a human on a wet market in Wuhan, and that is kind of a symptomatic of the way in which humans have transgressed species boundaries and barriers by bringing these two species first of all together in close proximity on a wet market, and then into human sort of human carriers that were working on it. And then and here's the second register: it spread all over the world because we have this high interconnection of populations going on, with air traffic mostly. So we have a high rate of transmission of interconnection, much higher than it was used for millions of years in which higher life has inhabited this planet. So we all know that viruses have mutation rates, right? They mutate over time. They adjust to their new hosts. This one didn't. It just captured millions of other human hosts in a blink of an eye, basically, across the world. So at one point, it is the close contact to species. Another sign is also that emerging infectious diseases, of which COVID-19 is, or SARS-CoV-2 is one virus of that. They proliferate, especially in species that are adapted to human environments, or that are close to being adapted to human environments. And that's one of the sort of scientific results of recent studies, that it's not only that we have catched a virus that was hidden in the tropical forests and somewhere in South Asia, but that these bats that carry these viruses, and there are 10,000s of more of them still lingering, that this has probably emerged or replicated in bats that are adapted to human environments. So that puts another pressure on virus mutation and their danger also to humans. So what we see is a sort of a concert of habitat destruction, of agriculture, of hunting, of agricultural practices, of trade of species that didn't happen before, but is now happening at a vast scale, not just in Southeast Asia or in East Asia, but also, as we have seen in the case of Ebola in Central Africa, for instance, right, where primates catched or transmitted Ebola just basically 2 decades ago, or maybe a little more. But we see a pattern that these emerging infectious diseases are on the rise. They are on the rise dramatically since about the 1940s. Because of these factors that humans intervene drastically into ecosystems, into species habitats, and that these viruses are also changing. If I could add one more point to that, another herd of viruses is animal husbandry and mass herding of animals in CAFOs or other industrial farming operations that provide an ideal hotspot for diseases to emerge. When introduced by wild animals, but then proliferating at enormous speeds in these genetically pretty homogeneous herds of pigs or of cattle farms, etc. So these kinds of big industrial agricultural operations also contribute to emerging infectious diseases, and all of that are pretty blatant signs of the Anthropocene, and their recasting global resources or natural resources into a sort of an industrialized food operation for humans.
Let me bring Bernd in on this. Thank you, Christoph. Anything you want to add to that, sort of things that we're seeing that manifest themselves as part of this virus that actually tell us a broader story as clues into the Anthropocene?
Perhaps 2-3 points when you look from an anthropocenic perspective on the virus. Number one, the virus itself is not a living being. It needs a host. And the host in this case, as Christoph described, were humans. So, and because of the host, so to say, the virus develops meaning. Without the host, the only meaning is to multiply and to transform. These are the two meanings which you can say are implied in the code of the virus. It has only this, let's say, minimal meaning. But in interaction with the host, which are humans, it develops this kind of superpower, transforming, so to say, to some extent, the planet, really transforming social and human life on the planet in quite a tremendous way. This is one aspect. The second aspect is what I mentioned also already before, that the transformation processes which took place in the Anthropocenic time, basically during the great acceleration of the last 60, 70 years, that the appearance of the virus is to some extent putting this under a microscope and where, let's say, the transformation which are from a human experiential point sometimes not possible to sense, get sensible. For example, climate change, as we know it, is very difficult to sense as a longer time process. You can experience phenomena of climate change, but not the climate change itself bodily. But with the virus, you can, which is spread, so to say, in weeks and months around the world because of human behaviors, you can directly feel that. So it's to some extent an accelerated Anthropocenic process. And also articulates the infrastructures. And Christoph has already mentioned that the whole mobility system and the infrastructures like airplanes, airports, and so on, which are supporting this kind of mobility. And what it turns out, what we can see is, in order to react to such a situation as the virus, we need now billions of dollars and euros to compensate, so to say, to the stop of these infrastructures. So we developed in the Anthropocene a world of basically massive infrastructures, which the virus to some extent puts to a test, you can say. And so in that sense, I think it's very interesting to look at it from an Anthropocenic point of view. Also with, of course, the question, are these kind of Anthropocenic infrastructures we developed in the last decades, are they sustainable in the future? Taking into account that we get more and more intertwined in our behavior and our actions with natural processes, which is, so to say, an implication of the Anthropocenic process, and needs in these kind of crises, because of this intertwinedness, incredible finances to deal with the situation. I think this is one aspect which is very important. The third aspect, perhaps, we may talk about is the relationship between knowledge production and the Anthropocene and the corona virus. Because what we are living through at the moment is knowledge production, so to say, in real time. Mm-hmm. Where knowledge production is used to react to the virus, and at the same time transforming, of course, our life conditions in a way so that we are living through kind of feedback loops, which are characteristic also for the Anthropocenic world. That we have not anymore, let's say, an outside perspective on the world, right, describing the world, but with the knowledge we produce, we are in a kind of constant interaction with world production, which reflects then again on our knowledge production.
I think it's such an interesting point, that knowledge production piece. And I've talked with several people on COVID calls about some of the ways that manifest itself, for example, with these very elaborate data visualizations, yeah, which to me harken back almost to the Cold War, and the idea of the Cold War expert being able to have the kind of dashboard to understand risk and translating risk to fellow experts or scientists, and occasionally trying to translate that risk to the public. But in this sense, these risks are being translated every minute to the public on the front page or the digital front page of newspapers around the world. So I like the way you're thinking about this, Bernd, in the sense that it's a not only knowledge production in real time, but a reckoning with that. And yes, risk toleration, for example, is one of the pieces of that we see in sort of, it's maybe not usually framed that way, but every day in the American news, we're talking about what we can and can't tolerate in terms of risk. I wonder.
Yeah, but this is one aspect. The other aspect is what is, of course, the implication of all simulations is that these simulated worlds, they reflect only a finite number of parameters to deal with. And I mean, we have, especially in Germany, I don't know to which extent that is taking, I mean, it's taking place in the United States too, of course, is what kind of knowledge should guide us in this situation? Is it just the knowledge by the virologists and epidemiologists, or do we need social scientists, economists, psychiatrists, and so on to become involved? So in which way our disciplinary knowledge systems can be reflect the situation we are in, and what are the models we should produce? I think that is from a knowledge perspective a very important discussion, because at the beginning basically health experts were discussing about the situation, but then of course economists came in, sociologists came in, and so on, and the question, what does that mean for social development, for individual development, the crisis we are in?
Christoph, let me bring you in on that. I mean, that's so interesting, and it does reflect cultural difference in the United States. The epidemiological reality of COVID-19 very quickly got turned into a discussion about the stock market. And, so then you see knowledge filtering through these many different layers. I've been thinking a lot about the status of scientists at this time, and I've seen such incredible extremes from Tony Fauci in the United States. I don't know if you have a German equivalent, but he's being held up now as our Galileo. I mean, he's a man who bears witness not only to science but to the inappropriate attack on science. And then at the same time, has to have, and maybe this is a peculiarly American thing, although I think maybe in Brazil it could be the same. He has to have bodyguards. I mean, he's under threat, and he's certainly under threat daily in a rhetorical sense. I'm making things a little binary, but I know as a historian of science, these kinds of issues are on your mind. Could you say a little bit about your thinking about science and scientists and how their reputation and status could be in flux in this time?
Even though I'm a historian of science, you catch me a little bit on my light foot here, because I haven't really reflected on the role of the sciences in all of this, beyond what is in our news as well, and beyond the death threats that go to the most popular epidemiologist that Germany has, who actually runs a podcast as well ever since February, I believe. Christian Drosten is his name. But I see that there is a renewed discussion about the role of science and scientific expertise in informing political decision making. I mean, we never had. I mean, we are fortunate enough that we have political leaders who, at least on paper, follow scientific advice, even though they have also neglected much of it for the past decades when it comes to climate change. Even they had one commission after the other, who was, arguing for a much more aggressive Energiewende, for instance, than actually took place. However, in general, I think one could say that the German government follows, at least to some extent, evidence-based science and to at least inform the parameters of their policies, and that turned out pretty fortunate for how Germany handled the virus in the first place. But still, I mean, we have also a minority in our population, but a very loud minority that, because Germany was so successful in containing the pandemic in the first place, they question the expertise and the closeness between scientists to the government. They question the validity of the strong measures that have been put in place, etc. So we have also quite a vibrant discussion going on in Germany at the moment as to what expertise, or not expertise, but what can how much influence should scientific advice have on the realm of politics as such?
May I come in on this?
Yeah, please do.
I mean, you can look at the Corona crisis, and I speak now from a German perspective, as a life experiment. And a life experience, that means that the scientists themselves, and they were very open about it, like people like Drosten, did not know all the implications right from the beginning. They did not know the phenomenon. They could not define the phenomena in all its complexity right from the beginning. So we're going through weeks and months where the scientists put on some results of their research. Politicians reacted to that, and they changed that in the process. So at the same time where we went through a life experiment, we went also through an education what science is, meaning that the natural scientists, and most of them were very clear about it, did not have the truth right from the beginning, but were in a kind of experimental process where at certain stages they came up with new findings. For example, at the beginning, in at least in the German discussion, which was really driven by the scientists, the role of masks was not clear. Mm-hmm. It was also not clear to which extent schools and kindergartens are major locations to spread the virus. And then, of course, analysis began. I mean, they started to analyze these situations. So this kind of truth or falsehood discussion, which was informing, let's say, the populist debates in the last years, were to some extent put on stage, what that means from a scientific perspective. So to some extent, I think quite, at least in Germany, quite a number of people learned that scientific knowledge does not mean there is one truth, but there may be also processes where you develop truth in the process. I think this was a very important point to that. Of course, there were, let's say, and especially right-wing people who started to speculate on kind of different kind of, basically criticizing science altogether. That was also there. But I think also when you take people who trust the sciences, and I think we had about 60 to 70% of the population which went with the government, who took basically decisions on scientific findings. Even these people, for these people, I think it's an open question. What do you mean with expert knowledge? Mm-hmm. Because there's expert knowledge by the epidemiologists, who give you, let's say, their perspective on how what the virus is, how it spreads, how, let's say, in quote, what kind of behavior the virus has. But this, of course, is just one aspect for the whole society. You have to have economical knowledge. You have to have social, political knowledge too, to make the picture bigger than just looking at what the epidemiologists and the virologists tell you. And of course, since these are, we have also clever natural scientists, the natural scientists said that at the point too, don't only listen to us, listen also to the others. So what became clear in the crisis in a very accentuated way is, what does it mean to live in a society where you have highly disciplinary knowledge, highly developed disciplinary knowledge, but knowledge which is quite fragmented. But you have to come up with solutions for the whole society, not just for one aspect of society. And I think this, from an anthropocenic point of view, is also very important to see, because if you want to deal with the anthropocenic transformation in a more holistic way, or in a more, let's say, eco-sensitive way, you have to look on different parameters, not just, let's say, parameters done by one of the special scientists. So in that sense, I think the corona crisis at least in the German context, brought up in different ways the question: what expertise, what kind of knowledge systems are needed to deal with these kind of large transformation which are going on.
Just a reminder to everyone that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Bernd Scher and Christoph Rosol. I think those points there that both of you were making about how maybe we're not usually used to, or we're not privy to the messiness of science playing out in real time and in public. It also, I mean, that's an important point to make, and it's also one in which I think it's worth bringing climate change back into this discussion, because I feel like scientists have grown so wary of the problem of change around climate science that, at least in the way they discuss it in the United States, the first thing that's always emphasized is consensus. It's said almost usually in this way: you will never find a scientist of any repute who disagrees with us. That's almost always the first thing that's said when climate science is discussed in the United States with the public, which is true, but it also downplays the vitality of the scientific process, which is about dispute. And that's an interesting tension that really burst into the public. Christoph, I want to ask you about this, because in the United States early on, one of the moves that was quite interesting was a discussion in which people who are in favor of what we here call a Green New Deal, or decarbonizing the economy, said, look, the impossible, what you told us was impossible, is perhaps possible. We've slowed down emissions. The industrial economy can be slowed. And as we come out of this, they had that discussion. That was a little tricky because nobody wanted to say we should have a pandemic in order to shift to a green economy. But the next part of what they said was crucial, because, and they're still saying it, as we move out of an economic crisis, why would we double down on the very technologies, the very kind of economy that brought us into what we're calling the Anthropocene? Why wouldn't we use this moment as an opportunity to move to a green economy? And I know you've been tracking that discussion in Germany. Can you say a little bit about how that's played out there? Because here we have a case where maybe transitions that are underway slowly, percolating along, could begin to happen quite rapidly, I think.
Yes, I agree. I mean, same situation over here. People or scientists, but also sustainability advocates, renewable energy advocates, etc., were scared at the outlook that the pandemic would throw us back several years now, with money that is now being spent on revitalizing the old fossil economy just to get people back, into their usual, workplace and pattern of money making. But it turned out that the speed at which this pandemic came over us has also accelerated the transition to a greener economy. At least this is sort of the net sum of decisions that have been made after the or over the last couple of months. Of course, prepared longer for a long time, especially on an EU level, and a commission that was very climate friendly from the outset, and that were planning to reveal what is here called the EU Green Deal anyways, even without the pandemic. But it has, I think, the COVID-19 has provided an opportunity to make that point more clearly and more explicitly, that this is about avoiding a slow disaster in a way that is in the back of the rapid disaster that is in front of our eyes, currently ongoing. And the hope is, of course, that populations are much more open for more aggressive and drastic measures now, since they have had this experience, the experience that things could actually change pretty fast, and the possibility of collapse is real. And in that sense, I think it has opened the eyes a little bit to that there is discontinuity in our world, that there is that there are things that are beyond, that are more important maybe than our everyday ongoings for once, right? That the experience of the lockdown was a very personal and a very emotional one, but also that on a bigger level, that also a lot of money can actually be spent or can be mobilized in order to cope with real threats. And now, of course, the aim is to sort of run this message home that it's not just a virus that threatens our health, but it's also climate change or biodiversity collapse that is threatening our societies and our health on a much more systemic level, and that we have to now create resilience for our societies to make this transition much faster than it has been ongoing for a while.
We're almost up on time. I want to try to get one more question in, and this question springs from a conversation I had with a member of the Anthropocene Working Group last year, Mark Williams. And Mark is an extraordinary scientist and fascinating person. And I asked Mark this question. I said, could you, so he's a specialist at reading core samples. And I asked him, I said, could you find the signature? We were talking about this search for the golden spike that you were talking about, Bernd, and how scientists use the sedimentary layers, how they read them in core samples. And I said, do you find a signature for slavery? If I challenged you to, could you locate, how fine can you get in the way that you read the sedimentary record? And that's crucial, I think, as part of this discussion of the locating where the Anthropocene begins. And with that, and he said, oh, absolutely, I could do that. And then I listened to him talk for the next half an hour, and he talked about all the many different ways that you go about doing that. And you both know him and his work, and you can imagine this conversation. But Bernd, let me ask you this. If we looked for the signature of this pandemic, what do you think it will look like? Again, sort of thinking, we've been talking a lot about society and the way we live it and understand it right now, but maybe projecting a little bit forward, what kind of a layer is this pandemic going to leave? Or do you think it won't? This is too much of an event located in time, and it will be part of something else, something broader. I ask this question because there's this tension between the event and the slower playing out processes, which, Christoph, you were just talking about, I think, in a way that's really important to how that gets translated into politics. But I wonder, what's the signature? What's in the sedimentary layer of COVID? Bernd, let me ask you that question. I waited until it's really late at night there to ask you these questions.
Yeah. It's naughty. I think we are really not in a position to say that at the moment, because we are still in the process. We really don't know how this process is going to end, or if it's going to end at all. because it becomes clearer and clearer that, for example, also the scientists say, even if we find vaccination and so on, we have to live with this virus. We have to develop modes of life which integrate the virus into our lives. And I think this is one lesson to learn from the situation we are in, which is also an Anthropocenic lesson, that we got to the Anthropocene as we know it because for a long time the major habitus of modernity was that we transform the world as we would like it to do. I mean, it's just our wish,
Right.
and
on our terms.
in our terms. So I think the lesson we can learn from the virus, but also from other climate change and so on, is that we have to develop again our sensibilities to understand also other agents in the world we are living in, and to integrate them in a larger picture, and not just trying to transform the world from our human perspective or the perspective of some actors of humanity. I think this is one major lesson we can learn. And in that sense, I would really argue also that the coronavirus, because of accelerating a lot of Anthropocenic processes, made us this to be experienced and not just a knowledge about.
Christoph, do you want to take us out at this question of the corona layer?
I'm not sure whether sediment cores are or ice cores are that highly resolved, have that fine resolution. But I think you could actually, at least locally, you could detect that little bump, around March, where global industrial pollution basically stopped for a few weeks. Right, you probably might even see that in the geological record, but it will be. I mean, it's just so short-lived, and it will be smeared out. So it definitely won't be visible in the longer future. But in general, you probably could detect this this moment when the human world came to a standstill. I believe so. That is definitely a historical moment in the history of modernity, at least, right? That an entire globe has been shut down for a few days.
May I add something to that?
Yes, please.
I think this point Christoph just made, that it may be not reflected in the sediment, this short is also a signification of the Anthropocene, because the processes of transforming the planetary system are now going so fast that using sediments to show demonstrate new Earth epochs may be not anymore good enough in the future. And we have to look for new ways of defining, so to say, Earth epochs in the future. And I think this is a very interesting reflection on how we define Earth epochs. And the discussion amongst the geologists and earth scientists that 50 years or 70 years, because the idea is to define the Anthropocene starting with after World War II, more or less, is already a challenge to the old concept of Earth epochs, which lasted ten thousands of years. And this transformation we are living in at the moment is so short, so accelerated, so to say, that the classical systems of defining Earth epochs may be not anymore good enough.
Just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls. I need to let my guests get to bed because it's after midnight in Berlin. And that last question that I asked, maybe that one, you could take that one. I feel like that could have some future at the house. Maybe in the future I'll get a chance to come back to Berlin and we could talk about that there at the house.
Be our guest again, please.
I miss these discussions with you both. I want to remind everybody also you can check out the work of the HKW. I would start with Anthropocene-curriculum.org just to get a sense of what was described earlier as the archive of this Anthropocene work. It's really
Scott, when we did the CC World project, the idea was to also create a kind of cultural archive of the COVID time we are living through. So this way of archiving the situations we are in may take different forms nowadays.
Well, let's keep the discussion going. And I want to remind everybody that you can catch COVID Calls any weekday from 5 p.m. And you can always catch us on YouTube Live or on Periscope or on Facebook. And I want to thank my guests, Bernd Scherer and Christoph Rosol, for spending this time with us. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about comedy in the Anthropocene, and not the Anthropocene, and COVID, although comedy in the Anthropocene would make a good topic too. We're going to talk about the pandemic and comedy with Kurt Braunohler, so please do join us for that. Bernd and Christoph, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. It was really great to talk to you.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow, 5 o'clock.